My name is Clara Walsh. I am 32 years old, and the day they sold me at the Dustwell auction was the day I stopped pretending the world was fair. I stood there in my dead husband's tattered coat, my wrists bound in iron, my children lined up behind me like lambs headed for slaughter, and the only sound louder than my heartbeat was the low murmur of men calculating what 5 extra mouths would cost them. The sheriff's voice rang sharp as a knife, rattling off debts I never signed for, names of creditors I never met, and a starting price that made my stomach lurch. I stared straight ahead, jaw tight, eyes dry, because crying was something I couldn't afford in public anymore. A man with a grease-slick smile made the first bid, half laughing as he sized me up like a mare past her prime. Another, older and red-eyed from whiskey, offered a few more coins and called out that he'd take the girl children but not the boys. I heard Tom stiffen behind me, barely 11, and already taught what that kind of tone meant. Elsie whimpered, only 3 years old and too young to know that mothers can't always protect what they birth. The bidding stalled until a voice from the back, quiet but certain, said one word, mine. Heads turned like shutters in a storm, and a tall man with silver hair under a sun-worn hat stepped forward, his boots coated in red trail dust. He didn't look at me the way the others did. He looked at the sheriff and asked what the price was to clear the debt in full. The sheriff stammered, named the number, and the man paid in coin straight from a pouch on his belt. No haggling, no questions, just finality. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't spit either. They just stepped back like the wind had changed direction, and none of them wanted to be caught in it. I met his eyes for the first time when he untied the chains from my wrists. Calloused hands, steady and dry, like someone who'd done hard things without apology. He didn't say a word as he handed me the reins to a second wagon already loaded with supplies. I didn't thank him. I didn't trust him. Not yet. But I climbed into that wagon with my children and drove away from the square, because a cage bought by kindness is still better than one built from cruelty. And for the first time in weeks, I breathed. The ride out to his ranch was quieter than any funeral I ever attended, and I've buried more than I care to name. The children clung to me like burrs on wool, silent and wide-eyed, their small bodies jostled by the rickety wagon's rhythm as Dustwell faded behind us. Ezra Dalton sat beside me on the bench, reins in hand, saying nothing, his face carved from the same rock that shaped the mountains. I could smell horses and dry wood and something else that reminded me of winter nights, cold and hollow. He had signed the paper with a hand that trembled just slightly, but not from fear. The sheriff made a point of warning him that 5 mouths would gnaw through his stores by Christmas, but Ezra had just grunted and handed over the silver like he was paying for grain instead of people. I didn't thank him, because I still wasn't sure if this was rescue or a slower kind of dying. I knew how men changed behind closed doors. I knew that charity was often just a trap in nicer words. My children had already learned to keep their heads down. Tom, my eldest, watched Ezra with narrowed eyes, ready to throw himself between me and danger if he had to, though he was only a boy. The girls sat pressed against each other, their small hands clasped tight. Elsie fell asleep against my shoulder halfway through the ride, and I wrapped her in the blanket Ezra had wordlessly passed me when the wind turned sharp. We didn't speak for miles, just the steady creak of wheels and the occasional snort of the horses filling the silence. The land stretched out like an ocean of gold and rust. No fences, no smoke from nearby chimneys, nothing but distance and wind. I saw the ranch before he said a word. It was a modest spread, weathered wood and a wide porch, a small barn in the back, and a coop that needed mending. Not much, but it didn't smell like whiskey or desperation. When we stopped, Ezra didn't help me down. He simply said, "The house is yours now too, feeds in the pantry, water's from the well. Take what you need." Then he walked off toward the barn with the slow steps of a man still carrying someone else's ghost. I stood there, holding Elsie, and looking at the door I was meant to call home, not yet knowing if I was free or simply traded. The days passed like smoke, drifting slow and without shape, and in that strange hush we all floated through, I kept my words folded tight behind my teeth. I cooked because it gave my hands something to do and my thoughts somewhere to hide, but I didn't offer small talk or pleasantries. I wasn't raised to fill silence just because it stretched too long. The children worked harder than they should have, but they didn't know any other rhythm. Labor was the only language they'd ever trusted. They fetched water, mucked stalls, and helped me with laundry without being asked. Ezra watched us without hovering, his presence more like the barn walls than a man. He never laid a hand on them, not even a pat on the head, and that silence between us all hung like wet clothes on a line, heavy and dragging but somehow necessary. The house was tidy, but too quiet, and sometimes I'd catch Ezra staring at the empty seat across from him at the table, the one he never filled. I didn't ask who it used to belong to. He didn't ask why I flinched whenever boots scraped the floor behind me. On the fourth day, Tom climbed too high in the hayloft trying to rig a pulley like he'd seen in town. The rope snapped, and I heard the thud from inside the kitchen. Before I could even wipe my hands dry, Ezra had already reached him, kneeling in the dust with both hands firm on Tom's shoulders. "Breathe slow," he said, calm as if he were telling a horse to settle. Tom had the wind knocked out of him, but nothing broken. I stood there holding the back door open, unsure what to say, so I said nothing. Tom didn't thank him, just nodded once and limped back to the house. Ezra didn't follow, just stood there looking up at the broken beam like it owed him an explanation. That night at supper, I made biscuits because the bread had gone stiff and the stew needed softening. I laid 7 on the tray, same as always, but as I passed his plate, I hesitated, then reached back for the basket and added 2 more. Ezra didn't look at me, didn't smile or nod. Just lifted one, split it clean with his thumb, and went on chewing like it was any other night. But when I cleared the table, there wasn't a crumb left. And I noticed the broken pulley had been mended before sundown. The house spoke in murmurs I wasn't meant to hear, not with words, but with the weight of what lingered in corners and behind doors left slightly ajar. Ezra didn't hover, didn't ask questions, just moved through the place like a man who knew every floorboard by memory and didn't care to learn any new ones. His wife was still here, not in ghostly form, but in the fabric of the place, in the lilac perfume clinging to the curtains that hadn't been washed since she'd gone, in the pressed dresses still hanging in a neat row inside the wardrobe, their sleeves empty but still reaching. I never went in that room, though I passed it often. The children knew better than to cross that threshold, sensing the same quiet gravity I did, except Elsie, who was too small to know what belongs to the living and what's been left behind. I was in the kitchen peeling carrots when I heard the faint creak of a door, and then the delicate clatter of porcelain. I wiped my hands on my apron and followed the sound, finding her perched on the edge of the widow's bed, her little fingers stroking the hem of a lace pillowcase. On the shelf above her sat a porcelain doll, its painted eyes wide and blue, the kind you don't give to children but place on mantels and expect never to be touched. Elsie had reached for it. Her small hand rested near its stiff curls when I saw Ezra standing just inside the doorway, his frame filling the light like a post in a storm. He didn't yell, didn't scold. He just watched her for a long breath, then crossed the room slowly, his boots soft on the rug that had faded under a chair no one sat in anymore. I waited, expecting him to pluck the doll away or carry Elsie out like a glass figurine. Instead, he crouched beside her and said in a voice not meant for scaring, "She would have liked you." Elsie turned to him, her eyes wide with the simple trust only the youngest carry, and placed the doll carefully in his hands like she was returning something precious. Ezra looked at it for a moment, then set it gently beside the pillow. I didn't speak, just backed away and let the silence settle back over that room like dust in sunbeams. Some houses speak loud with voices and fights. This one whispered with grief, and we were all learning how to live inside it. It happened just after supper, when the sky was still streaked orange and the wind had that restless edge it gets before something turns. I was scrubbing plates, the girls were picking over what was left of the cornbread, and Ezra was out back feeding the mules. The smoke came first, curling in through the window like a bad memory, and then Tom was yelling, "Barn's on fire, Mama!" I dropped the dish so hard it shattered, and ran barefoot into the yard, heart thudding, skirts bunched in my fists. Flames were licking up the side of the barn like they'd been fed kindling soaked in spite. No lightning, no spark from the forge, no reason except hate dressed in kerosene and silence. Ezra was already hauling buckets from the trough, shouting orders sharp and clear. Tom and Ruth formed a line. Elsie cried until I scooped her up and sat her near the well with a damp cloth over her mouth, and then I joined the bucket line, my arms aching, smoke stinging my throat. The fire took the east wall and half the hay, but we saved the animals, the roof, and our breath. When it was over, Ezra stood staring at the charred boards, with a look that wasn't surprise, just weariness like he'd been expecting it since the day he signed our names. The sheriff came the next morning, asked questions with no answers, then left muttering about boys and mischief, and how nobody really meant no harm. Ezra didn't mention the tracks we saw near the back fence, or the slur carved into the wood post where the fire started. He didn't tell the sheriff about the bottle we found half melted, or how the matches had been left behind like a dare. That night, after the children had finally gone quiet, and the stars stretched out like cold coins in a black purse, I found Ezra sitting on the porch, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. I sat beside him, waiting. After a long silence, he spoke low and rough, like a man coughing up something that had lodged deep. Said his wife died giving birth to a son that never drew breath, that he buried them both on the hill where the wildflowers now grow too thick. I didn't speak right away. Just let the weight of it settle between us like a quilt too heavy to move. Then I said the only truth I knew. You still saved 6. He didn't look at me, but his hand brushed mine. And for once, the silence didn't feel so alone. I hadn't touched flour for anything but gravy since before the auction, but one morning after the ash from the barn fire had settled and the fence had been mended, I woke before the sun and decided the house needed to smell like something warm. Not because Ezra asked, and not because the children expected it, but because the walls had started to feel less like stone and more like skin, and I wanted it to breathe with something other than smoke. I pulled out the old crock of lard, beat the dough till it was smooth, and watched as the biscuits rose slow and steady in the oven. When Ruth came downstairs and caught the scent, she blinked like she wasn't sure if she was dreaming. By the time the rest of them shuffled in, sleepy and wide-eyed, the kitchen smelled like my mother's kitchen used to smell before sickness took her voice and firewood got too expensive. That morning, we ate in silence, but it was a full kind of quiet, the kind that fills your bones instead of emptying them. The children started laughing again, not all at once, but in little bursts like fireflies on the first warm night of summer. Tom rigged the old windmill back to life, using scrap metal and stubbornness, and when it spun clean and smooth in the breeze, he stood there beaming like he'd lassoed the wind itself. Ezra took Elsie down to the creek after chores one afternoon, a line in his hand and her chubby little fingers wrapped around the pole like it was made of gold. I watched them from the hill near the coop, trying not to smile too wide when she shrieked at the first tug on the line. That night, after everyone was asleep and the lamps were out, I was putting up linens in the hallway cupboard when I saw it wedged behind an old quilt, a photo album, its leather cover cracked with time and love. I opened it slowly, careful with the binding, and saw them, Ezra, and a woman with wild dark hair, eyes like riverstone, standing in front of the same porch where I now hung laundry. There were only 6 photos, each one a little piece of joy frozen in a past I didn't belong to. I didn't ask questions. I didn't cry. I closed the album, kissed the cover once for the woman who once made this place a home, and slid it back into the dark where I found it. Some things are sacred, even if you don't speak them aloud. It was a Thursday morning when the rider came, not with dust in his wake or urgency in his gait, but with the smug stillness of a man who knew his paper carried more weight than any bullet. He dismounted slow, dusting off his jacket like the ground here offended him, and when he knocked on the frame of the front porch, I knew something was off before a word left his mouth. Ezra had just come in from the field, his boots thick with mud and his brow damp with sweat, and he stood behind me as I opened the door. The man introduced himself with a title too long and a tone too smooth, then handed Ezra a stack of papers bound in red twine. His words came cold and clipped, explaining that the sheriff who had sold me and my children at auction had acted outside the law. The debts were real, but the auction had no legal standing. I stood there frozen, the words both freeing and terrifying. I was not property. I had never been. But that freedom came tangled. The children, he said, were another matter. Without legal guardianship or documented birthright, they could be claimed by the state, split up, placed in homes across the territory. He said it like he was listing off market prices, like lives and love meant no more than misplaced cattle. Ezra didn't speak until the man was gone, until the hoofbeats faded down the trail. Then he looked at me and said, "I'll fix it." Just like that. No drama, no hesitation. He left before dawn the next morning, saddlebags packed light, rifle strapped to his back, and not a word to the children except a squeeze to Tom's shoulder. I watched him ride off, his silhouette shrinking against the rising sun, and felt a fear deeper than any I'd known. Not because I doubted him, but because I didn't know how to stand still while someone else fought for me. That week stretched long and cruel. I ran the ranch as best I could, taught Ruth how to knead bread, kept the hens from pecking Elsie, and helped Tom mend a split fence post during a thunderstorm that rattled the walls. I didn't sleep much. On the 7th day, just as the wind began to shift and the children were setting the table for supper, I heard hoofbeats slow and limping. Ezra rode in looking 10 years older and walking with a hitch in his step, dust caked to his shirt like a second skin. He didn't speak as he reached into his coat and handed me 6 documents, each sealed and stamped. Clara Dalton, Tom Dalton, Ruth, Elsie, and the twins too. All ours now, all legal. I held them to my chest like they were newborns. Ezra said, "Now no one can take what's already home." And for the first time in years, I believed it. The storm came fast and loud, not with warning or mercy, but with a crack of sky so fierce it made Elsie scream in her sleep and sent the chickens into a frenzy before the first drop even fell. I had felt it in my bones all afternoon, the pressure curling in my joints like an old sorrow, the air too still, too thick, like the world was holding its breath. By the time the wind picked up and the first gust slammed the porch door against the wall, Ezra was already hauling tarp out to the barn and shouting orders over his shoulder. I didn't wait to be told. The children were gathered in the main room, blankets tight around them and eyes wide, and I kissed each forehead before throwing on my boots and heading into the dark. Rain fell sideways, slicing across the yard like glass, and we moved together without speaking, tying the stable doors, moving the oxen in closer, pitching feed into dry corners so the horses wouldn't panic. I lost count of how many buckets we used trying to keep the chicken coop from flooding, and by the time lightning split the sky and lit the east pasture in a violent flash, I had mud in my teeth and water running down my back like I'd been swimming through the earth itself. We heard the cattle cry out just before the tree exploded, a sharp crack like a rifle going off in the heavens, and when we reached the clearing, the fire was already burning low in the rain. 6 of them lying still beneath what remained of the old oak. Ezra stood there for a long time, hat in hand, his face unreadable. I didn't speak. I knew the look of a man counting losses he couldn't afford to grieve just yet. We buried them in the morning, what was left, and gave no words because some things are too hard to say without sounding hollow. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire in the hearth finally took the chill from the air, Ezra came in from the porch, still damp around the collar and moving slow, like everything in him ached. He handed me a mug of coffee, hot and black, and sat beside me without ceremony. We didn't speak for a while, just sipped and listened to the wind dragging itself across the roof like it had nowhere left to go. Then he said it, quiet but firm. "You don't owe me anything, but I'd be honored if you stayed." I didn't answer right away, just reached for his hand, calloused and warm, and held it in the quiet. Some offers aren't made with expectations, they're made with hope, and I had just enough left to say yes without saying a word. The rumors reached us before the frost did, carried in the mouths of churchwomen with hands too idle and hearts too small to mind their own porches. At first it was just whispers in town, mutterings in the general store when I went to buy flour or cloth, women pausing mid-sentence when I passed. Eyes flicking to the children like counting them proved something shameful. Then came the louder things, the ones that made it over fence rails and traveled with riders who stopped for water and stayed long enough to say too much. They said Ezra had lost his grip. That grief had twisted his mind so badly he couldn't tell the difference between charity and scandal. They said a woman like me, brought in on a coin and a piece of paper, couldn't possibly be clean. They invented lovers I never had, debts I never owed, even sins I hadn't known existed until someone gave them my name. I never responded. I had spent too long trying to survive to waste breath on people who'd already decided who I was. But I heard every word, and I carried them like stones in my apron. The children heard them too, and I saw the way Tom started walking behind me in town, like he could block the words with his body. Ezra never asked me what they said. He didn't need to. He'd lived enough life to know the shape of judgment when it crept across a man's land like drought. The preacher came one morning, just as the sun broke through the clouds, and I was hanging linens on the back line. He arrived on a tired horse and walked slow, like he wanted the neighbors to see he had come to do the Lord's work. Ezra met him on the porch. I couldn't hear every word, but I didn't need to. I could read them in the preacher's posture, in the way he held his Bible like a weapon instead of a comfort. He spoke of appearances, of what folks might say, of reputations and righteousness. Ezra didn't argue. He just stood there listening, arms crossed, face unreadable. Then he reached for the door, said something quiet I couldn't make out, and shut it before the man had finished his sermon. The preacher turned and left without a backward glance. I watched from the window, my hand resting gently on the back of Ezra's chair, feeling the smooth wood beneath my palm like it tethered me to something solid. That night, we ate dinner as usual, the children laughing about a goat that had gotten into the pantry. Ezra passed me the bread without a word, and I took it without thanks. In a world full of noise and names not given kindly, sometimes the most radical thing you can do is sit beside someone and not move. And that's what we did. We stayed. Together, in the silence they would never understand. It started with a box of rags in the attic, tucked behind an old trunk that smelled of cedar and thyme. I'd gone up there looking for extra candles and came down holding pieces of two women's lives folded and waiting. Some were soft and faded with wear, the colors dulled by sun and memory. I knew at once which ones had belonged to her, Ezra's wife. There was a blue calico with tiny white flowers that I'd seen once in a photo, a bit of lace still clinging to one corner, and a striped muslin that felt too fine for workdays. I sat with them on the floor that night, running my fingers over every piece, and then I added to the pile bits of my own story, a scrap from the dress I wore when Elsie was born, A square from the apron Ruth tore climbing the fence the day we arrived. A corner of Tom's old shirt that he had outgrown but refused to throw away. It came together slow, each stitch a quiet offering to the life we were building, and I let the children help, their small hands clumsy at first, but careful as they learned. Ruth picked out colors, her eye for balance sharper than mine. Tom pressed the seams with the edge of the iron, proud of how straight he could keep them. Even the twins took turns laying pieces out on the table, rearranging them until they looked just right. We worked on it through the evenings, after supper when the chores were done and the fire crackled low in the hearth. Ezra would sit nearby, carving or reading or just staring into the flames, not asking questions, not interfering. He didn't know what we were making. I wanted it that way. I wanted it to be a gift that asked for nothing in return. When it was finished, I waited for the right moment. The sky had turned pale with frost that morning, and the wind carried the sharpness of approaching winter. I laid it out on the table, the whole thing stretched wide like a story told in thread. Every square was a breath of something we'd survived. Grief, hunger, fear, hope. Ezra came in from the yard, boots thick with mud, and paused when he saw it. He didn't speak, just stepped close, hands still rough from work, and traced the seams like they held more than fabric. He ran his fingers over the blue calico, paused at the worn patch of Tom's shirt, then looked at me like he was seeing something not even the quilt could explain. His voice was soft when he said it, barely above a whisper. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." And in that moment, I felt like maybe the dead weren't gone. Maybe they were sewn into us, square by square, waiting for someone to remember them with tenderness instead of pain. It was near midday when the riders came, kicking up dust on the main trail like they meant to unsettle more than just dirt. I had just finished hanging the last of the laundry and was turning to call the children in for cornbread when I saw them through the glare. 3 men on horseback moving with the kind of certainty that says they don't expect to be told no. One was the sheriff, his hat pulled low, badge shining like a threat pinned to his chest. The other 2 I didn't recognize, but their posture told me enough. Hired hands. Hired for one thing, and it wasn't justice. I called for Tom, told him to take the others inside and keep them there no matter what he heard. He nodded once, jaw tight, already pulling Elsie to his side. I stood at the porch with my hands clenched in my skirt, watching as the sheriff dismounted with a folded paper in hand. Ezra came from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, calm like always, but I saw the change in his eyes the moment he caught the sheriff's face. They spoke low at first, the sheriff waving the paper, something about debt, about a man I hadn't heard of in years claiming the children as unpaid collateral. I felt my throat close up. The kind of fear that doesn't scream but coils, slow in your gut, cold and sure. I opened my mouth to speak, to argue, to plead if I had to, but before I could, Ezra stepped forward and put himself between them and the door. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He just held his rifle like it was an extension of his body, calm and ready, and looked the sheriff square in the face. No one moved. The wind slowed, the chickens quieted, even the trees seemed to lean in closer. The sheriff glanced at the 2 men behind him, both of them shifting uneasy in their saddles. I watched him falter. Not much, just a flicker in his eyes, the kind men have when they realize the fight they expected won't go how they thought. He mumbled something about confusion, said he'd need more paperwork, and turned his horse around without another word. The other 2 followed. They didn't look back. We watched until they were gone, until the dust settled and the sky felt still again. That night, I sat at the table while Ezra fixed the latch on the back door and the children played with buttons on the floor. I felt something crack inside, something long held and tight, and I wept. Not from fear this time, not from loss or helplessness, but from the kind of gratitude that swells so full in your chest you have to let it out or drown in it. For the first time, in too long, my tears tasted like relief, like safety, like a promise kept. It started with a question, quiet and unsure, asked while I was peeling apples and Tom was sweeping the porch. He leaned against the doorway, his broom forgotten in one hand, and said, not meeting my eyes, "Do you think Mr. Dalton would teach me to read?" It caught me off guard, not because of the request, but because of the way he said it, like it mattered more than food or sleep. I wiped my hands on my apron and nodded once, my heart already fuller than I could name. That night after supper, when the dishes were done and the younger ones tucked into quilts, Tom brought an old Bible from the shelf and handed it to Ezra like he was passing over something sacred. Ezra sat in his chair by the fire, spectacles perched low on his nose, and patted the stool beside him. "Start with the letters," he said, his voice low and patient. Tom sat tall, eager and nervous, his finger tracing over the page. A was first, then B, each one a little doorway to a world he'd never been invited into before. The others watched from the rug, pretending not to be interested, but by the third night Ruth was mouthing the sounds with him, and the twins were echoing them under their breath. Even Elsie sat in my lap, humming the alphabet like it was a song she had always known. I watched from the table, hands folded around a mug of tea gone cold, and felt something stir in me. I thought I'd buried back in Missouri. I went to the cupboard the next morning and pulled out the old tin where I kept things too fragile to throw away. Inside was my mother's journal, half full of her cramped handwriting, and a bundle of paper I'd once used to write recipes and prayers. I sharpened a pencil with Ruth's whittling knife and wrote my name. Just that, Clara. The letters looked smaller than I remembered, but steadier too. That night, I sat beside the fire and copied down measurements for stew and biscuits, the kind of things I wanted the children to know one day without needing me to show them. Ezra smiled at me from his chair, said nothing, just kept helping Tom sound out the word bread. A few days later, Ruth crawled into bed beside me after the lamps were out and whispered so softly I almost didn't catch it. "Mama, is Mr. Dalton our new pa?" I didn't answer, not right then. Just kissed her forehead and held her until she fell asleep. But the next evening, when we all sat at the supper table and Ezra bowed his head to say grace, I reached across the breadbasket, laid my hand gently over his, and left it there. He didn't flinch. Just looked up, smiled at me, and said amen like it meant something new. Like maybe it always had. We married without fanfare, without bells or banners or townsfolk dressed in their Sunday best, just the children and the wind and a sky so blue it looked like God had wiped it clean just for us. It was spring, the kind that comes late in these parts, where the earth takes its time to thaw and bloom, but when it does so with conviction. Wildflowers had crept up along the edge of the pasture, little bursts of yellow and purple and white, like the ground itself had something to celebrate. We stood in a patch of them, barefoot in the soft dirt, with Tom holding a book that wasn't a Bible but close enough, his voice steady as he read the words we'd chosen. Ruth had made a crown of dandelions for my hair, and the twins passed around lemonade in mismatched mugs like it was a feast. Elsie clung to Ezra's leg during the whole thing, her face tucked into his knee, until he bent down and scooped her up with one arm while saying his vows with the other. I didn't wear a gown, just a clean dress I'd stitched last winter, pale blue with a white sash. Ezra wore his best shirt, the one with no patches and all the buttons still intact. When it came time to exchange rings, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple band carved from cedar, smooth and warm with the faint scent of wood still clinging to it. He slipped it on my finger like he was placing something delicate into the earth, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. I didn't have gold or silver to offer in return, so I gave him my word, and with it, a promise unspoken. A second chance at being something more than a man alone. A father again, a husband again, not to replace what he had lost, but to build something new from the ashes of what we both had survived. After the vows were said and the lemonade gone, we kissed under the tree where the children now played, the same one where Tom had once tried to build a swing with fraying rope, and too much hope. The breeze lifted the edge of my dress, and Ezra's hand found the small of my back like it belonged there. I heard the children laughing in the distance, Ruth chasing the twins, Elsie trying to keep up with her arms flailing like wings. It wasn't a wedding anyone would remember in town, but it was ours. And in that patch of wildflowers, with dirt on my heels and cedar on my hand, I felt more like a bride than I ever had before. Not because of the ring or the vows, or the way Ezra looked at me like I was something holy, but because I had chosen this. We had chosen each other, not out of need or debt, but because love had finally made a quiet home in us both. It had been a full year since Ezra bought my freedom with a single word and an outstretched hand, and when the harvest came, it felt less like the end of a season and more like the proof of a promise kept. The land had bloomed under our hands, not just in crops but in the way the house breathed differently now, the way laughter came easier, and the wind didn't sound so lonely when it moved through the trees. The wheat stood tall and gold in the field, swaying like prayer, and the orchard gave up its apples without fuss. Tom worked beside Ezra from sunup to sundown, strong now in the shoulders and quiet in the way men get when they start thinking long thoughts. They plowed side by side, two sets of boots carving lines into the earth, and I often watched them from the kitchen window, apron dusty and heart too full to name. Ruth helped me run the pantry, sharp-eyed and efficient, scribbling notes in the ledger in handwriting far neater than mine ever was. The twins gathered eggs and learned to mend fences without turning it into a game, though they still chased each other through the barn when they thought no one was watching. Elsie followed me everywhere with her hands full of wildflowers and questions I couldn't always answer. But the one she asked the most came without warning, tugging at my skirt while I hung laundry or stirred stew. "Where's Papa?" she'd say. And every time she meant Ezra. The first time she called him that, we were all sitting at supper and she dropped her fork. He bent down to pick it up, and she giggled, "Thank you, Papa," like it was the most natural thing in the world. He looked at me, eyes shining just enough to show it meant more than he could say, and I reached for his hand beneath the table and squeezed once. No one mentioned it aloud after that, because it didn't need explaining. We had become something whole. No contracts, no debts, just a house filled with voices and footsteps and love stitched together in quiet, steady rows. I kept the books balanced, the shelves stocked, and the table full. Ezra kept the fences strong, the fields plowed, and the children safe. We met in the middle, every day, and built something that felt like it had always been waiting for us. When neighbors passed by now, they tipped their hats with respect instead of suspicion. The preacher even came by with a pie and a softer tone. The past still lived in the corners of the attic and the scars on our hands, but it no longer ruled us. As we gathered the last of the squash and loaded the carts for market, I looked at Ezra standing beside Tom, both of them smiling at something I couldn't hear, and I knew the truth of it. We weren't surviving anymore. We were living, and no one, not law or man or fate, could take that from us now. The traveler came through just as the leaves were starting to turn, his horse thin and his face drawn, with the kind of weariness that speaks of too many nights under hard stars. He asked if he could water his horse, and Ezra nodded without needing much more. We had just finished supper, and the children were inside playing dominoes near the hearth while the fire snapped soft and steady. I brought the man a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, watched as he took them with a kind of quiet reverence, like kindness was rarer than food. He sat on the edge of the porch, boots dusty and worn, eyes scanning the yard like he was trying to make sense of something that didn't quite add up. After a while, he said, "They yours?" and nodded toward the window, where the children's shadows danced across the floor. Ezra looked out, then leaned back in his chair, with the kind of stillness that comes from years of listening more than talking. "Not by blood," he said, "but mine all the same." The traveler didn't press, just sipped slow from the tin cup. But after a long pause, Ezra started to speak, his voice low, and even like he was telling the story to the night itself. He told him how I came into his life, not with flowers or softness, but with iron on my wrists and 5 children holding on to me like they were the only thing keeping me upright. How he saw something in me at that auction that didn't look like surrender, and how he couldn't walk away. He didn't talk about himself much, not usually, but that night he said it plain. That after burying his wife and son, after waking too many mornings to silence, he'd figured that maybe some men were meant to be alone until he saw us. Until he gave a thirsty woman a cup of water and found his soul wasn't as dry as he thought. The traveler listened without interrupting, and when Ezra finished, he asked the one question most folks do. "Why'd you do it?" And Ezra just smiled, the kind of smile that lives deep in the eyes and takes its time getting there. "Because a man with no one is the poorest kind of man," he said. "And I'd already buried one family. I wasn't going to lose another." The traveler sat quiet after that, like the wind had taken the words and laid them down beside him. When he left the next morning, he shook Ezra's hand like it meant something, then tipped his hat to me and the children as we waved from the porch. And when the dust of his trail finally settled, I looked over at Ezra standing in the doorway, coffee in one hand and Elsie's small fingers wrapped around the other. And I knew that no matter what this world had taken from us, it had given something back, something whole, something real.